So we heard about the science and some of the risks and challenges of de-identification. We heard about how companies are using data for health-related services and how essential that is. And we heard about some interesting consumer products, location services, and Google Translate. And now the hard questions. What happens when what we're talking about is not curing cancer and not helping kids find their way home and translating English into 63 languages and 63 languages into 63 other languages? How about when we're talking about analyzing and understanding what consumers do online to provide better websites, to support advertising, to track and analyze and understand advertising? And so we have today a mix of interesting folks, and we're going to try to be as interactive with the audience here, because lots of you are tilling this soil and are valuable resources as well. To my left, Michael Bloom. Michael is the general counsel at Quantcast. To his left, Michael Ho, founder and VP of Business Development at Bering Media. Some of you may know Bering as a company that works in a privacy by design manner with ISPs and others to better geographically target advertising. Justin Brookman, long known as the lead of the Consumer Privacy Project at CDT. Peter McGee, who many of you know from his many years of service at the Federal Trade Commission. And Ashkan Soltani, technologist, an independent researcher who's been at the center of many of the recent privacy debates. Let me also introduce to some of you who've been doing this for a long time like me, Dan Jay, one of the founders of behavioral advertising at Engage many years ago, and then at Dakota and advertising.com, and now running a company called Correlate, which appends on and offline data with an interesting privacy angle, which maybe we'll hear about from him and from from Sheila and others. So let me throw perhaps first to Michael, Michael Ho, who is going to tell us a little bit about how they have ventured into certainly an area of privacy sensitivity, working with ISPs. A lot of noise about that in the last couple of years. And you guys have done it with some interesting privacy bells and whistles. And how does it work? What does it look like? And what can you tell us?
Sure. Thanks, Jules. As Jules mentioned, we work with internet service providers, and what I'd like to sort of talk about today is how internet service providers are, when it comes to geo-targeting, are actually in a unique position to improve privacy on the internet. And when I talk about geo-targeting, it's really about the ability to deliver online content based on real-world geography. So if we look at what's currently out there today, and sort of the standard are these IP lookup databases. And so the way they work is when I go to, for example, when I go to google.com in Canada, I get redirected to google.ca. That's based on the location or the inferred location of my IP address. These databases work in this sort of lookup and disclosure model. When I go to google.com, Google looks up in this database, gets my IP address, gets my location, or where the inferred location says I'm in Canada, and then makes a decision based on that. It's similar to ad servers use this information to geo-target ads. These databases are typically accurate at the aggregate level, so at the city level, the state, the country level. Where we saw some privacy concerns and where we feel that the ISPs can play a significant role is as these databases try to get more granular, as they try to go down to the accurately at the zip code or the zip +4 level, or even further down to the household address level. These databases work by collecting data, so they watch how packets hop through the network, and they try to reverse engineer where the location of IP address is located. Turns out that the internet service providers, by being the network operators, actually have all this data. They know the exact location of every IP address on their network. There's no need to collect any additional data on subscribers. The challenge is we don't want them to disclose that information to any third parties. And we don't want to have sort of this trusted entity in the middle where the ISPs pass them their data, the advertisers pass them their data, and it does sort of this matching and becomes this sort of safe haven. So we wanted to use technology to solve this problem. So working with Ann Kavukian and her group, we've come up with this technology called our double-blind privacy architecture. And it's a technology platform that ensures that the advertisers get all the benefits, so they're able to advertise based on real-world geography accurately without the disclosure of any user information. There's no disclosure of a user zip +4, there's no disclosure of a user zip code, location information. And we do this by installing equipment down at the ISP's network where the data is currently residing. And we do all the matching down and within the ISP's network. So rather than an ad server's looking up an IP address, expecting back the location, and then doing the matching, does this match the campaigns that I'm targeting? We do all the matching down in the ISP's network where the data already exists. So that when an ad server needs to deliver an ad, instead of looking it up and getting back the location, we can just respond back with, yes, it matches who you're trying to target, or no, it doesn't match us. So if we're trying to target within a 5-mile, 10-mile radius of this location, instead of providing back the exact address of where that user's located, we can respond back with, yes, it matches your target area, yes, it matches the 5 or 10-mile radius, or no, it doesn't. And we can add a bunch of privacy mechanisms in to make sure that we're not using sort of arbitrary terms for aggregation. So we're not using a 1-mile radius, because a 1-mile radius here might make sense, but a 1-mile radius in the rural environment may only match a couple households. So we can use empirical tests for aggregation to make sure that the data responding back with is always aggregated information and de-identified.
Thank you. So, Michael, you come from the traditional world of online behavioral advertising. Tell us a bit about what's collected, why, what's the point of all this? Does it really work? You hear critics saying, well, we're skeptical this behavioral advertising really works. Everything would be fine, without it. I assume your clients believe that it works.
Yeah, sure. So I'm at Quantcast. Quantcast helps publishers, websites understand their audiences, and helps advertisers and consumers see the most relevant ad. And the way that we do that is we have anonymous web surfing behavior that we get from the publishers' sites. And a lot of the discussion today is about anonymity and de-identification, and so let me table that for a second and come right back to it. So we have anonymous web surfing behavior, and what we do is our customers are, for instance, BMW. What BMW does is they put a tag on their page that they think really identifies a great customer. For instance, their page where you actually configure a 5 Series BMW. You pick the paint color, you pick the interior. These are great Beamer customers, but you don't need to show them an ad because they're already there. So we aggregate their pattern of surfing behavior. They tend to maybe not go to Yahoo, whereas the rest of the population goes to Yahoo. And then we show BMW ads to others who match that surfing pattern, all anonymously. There's no way for small publishers to do this, of course, on their own, but the benefit accrues to the small publishers in that the price per advertisement is 10 to 100 times higher than if we didn't do it this way. For instance, if you just did it contextually. The benefit to the publisher is that they can show less ads, there can be more publishers, and there can be a greater variety of information on the web. I think one of the criticisms, that's lobbied back and forth, there's often this wouldn't even exist if we couldn't do this way. Well, that's not true. Of course, the web would still exist, but small publishers don't have any capability of raising this kind of revenue from advertising without advertising that really works, 10 to 100 times better than other ads. So technologically, we don't collect any PII or identified data. From a policy perspective, we don't need or want any PII or identified data. wouldn't help our system. We set the whole thing up so that we can avoid taking any information like that. But I think a better question, and one that's more pertinent to today, is can the data be re-identified? And there, I think, some of the discussion that's taken place already is really instructive in terms of trying to understand it's not really identified, not identified, but how identifiable is it, and what are the motivations for re-identifying the data? So, you know, we, for instance, and different players in the industry work differently, but there were a few commentators today who talked about de-identified data providing a great public good when you distribute it. Well, the first thing to note is that we don't distribute any of the data. So there isn't anybody else who is out there with this data set. So we don't share it. We also mask it internally. We also restrict its use. And as importantly, there's not a lot of motivation to re-identify the data. You know, browsing data, an analogy we use is like grains of sand in an hourglass. No grain is really worth anything. This isn't like credit card data or some data where, you know, there's an incentive to break into a system and grab it. No individual grain's worth anything, and you need the well-calibrated hourglass to use it for any value. And only we have the hourglass that can use it this way. There were a few, just to close up, there were a few interesting rubrics in the tools that were used earlier for trying to answer this question. And one of the interesting things was, well, are we talking about the public use of the data? Are we talking about, what about internal use? What if somebody wants to, you know, check what their girlfriend is doing or something like that? This is why we mask it and obfuscate it and have controls internally. But I think it's true what people said about there being no perfect solution. You know, but someone also mentioned that, you know, if they wanted to check on someone they would run through their trash. They wouldn't break into a huge complex system. You know, there are parental controls that you can put on a computer that tell you all of the browsing behavior that happens on a computer. You don't have to, you know, break the security of a complex system to do that.
So let me ask you this question to start jumping in, and we'll go down the line, but let me jump in. Certainly there are folks who append other data to web surfing data, and they are appending data that perhaps may be personal, and they're going through a process that de-identifies or joins it in some non-personal way. The question I get all the time from folks is, how hard do I have to work to do that well? Can I just strip off the name and put it together and I've done it? As long as I don't keep these things together forever? Do I have to have a third party in between? Do I need encryption and a key and all sorts of interesting bells and whistles so that I can say, yes, I have joined data on and offline, but I could never impossibly identify? Where do you think the industry sits? Clearly on the HIPAA world or others, we have, you know, industry standards. We understand to some degree what the rules need to be, and we have discussion of whether that's good enough. Do we have any transparency in sort of the marketing, advertising side of, you know, how hard do you need to jump? Do you need to do, Dan says he's got, you know, subpoena-proof stuff. Other folks say, well, it's not subpoena-proof, but I've promised that it won't be identified, and I can't, or I have internal controls. Where do you think we stand there? Do we need guidelines? Is it fuzzy? Are we all doing? Are companies doing a good enough job? What's your thought?
Well, this is a place where I really believe in privacy by design. So, you know, the idea is to set up a system so that, you know, ideally you don't even have to go de-identify. You're starting with information that is not identified. But, you know, I think it'd be great to have standards about this kind of thing and what it, you know, takes to. The interesting thing we've talked about all day is that it's context dependent. But as far as, you know, what data would have to be removed the way HIPAA does it, that's kind of interesting proposal.
So Peter, what do you think we should draw from the way the FTC has been going in recent years? The online behavioral advertising report was sort of the first time, I think, that the agency said, you know what, maybe I shouldn't stress as to whether it's personal or not. It could be personal. There's IP addresses, search. If it's behavioral of some sort, people should know about it, and you should jump through some bigger hoops to give people better notice and better choice. And it didn't rely on what 10 years ago, when the Network Advertising Initiative principles were worked out, that was sort of the big line. If it wasn't personal, you could just say things in a privacy policy and give an opt-out. If it was going to be personal, then you had to say things on a web page and give a big opt-out, and if it was going to be retroactive data. But there was this big line, and that's to some degree why I think a lot of the industry jumped through a lot of hoops to stay on the it's not personal side of the line. Is that blurring? Does it not matter? We heard earlier a gentleman say, well, maybe it doesn't matter if I identify you. If I can, tailor an ad or treat you differently or do something, then maybe it doesn't matter. The kids' privacy guidelines propose, that kids' data is deemed personal if it's used across sites or collected across sites. Do we see the agency blurring the line? Do they not care anymore whether it's personal or not? It's a matter of how you use it. What do you think we ought to be looking to see?
Well, first I just have to say that my comments today are my own, so this is not on behalf of the commissioners. But from staff's perspective, and to go back to what you said, when we issued the online behavioral advertising principles and then the final report on those in February of 2009, we did discuss how this traditional line between PII and non-PII had started to blur, and perhaps that bright line distinction was not as meaningful as it had been in the past. And we cited things like the AOL incident where research data was supposedly anonymous and was put out, and arguably it was easily identified or connected to specific individuals. So what we said is, rather than focusing on this traditional bright line distinction, we looked at whether data can be reasonably linked to a specific consumer or computer or device, which would be the proxy for the consumer. And I think that there was general support for this idea that the line was less clear than it had been. When we issued our preliminary privacy framework last year, in discussing the scope of that framework, we used a similar standard, which is the privacy framework would apply to data that can be reasonably linked back to a consumer, computer, or device. We solicited public comments on that standard. We asked whether it was feasible. We asked about different technological ways to make data, anonymous. And we got a lot of comments on that issue. And I think that there was, again, general support for this notion of the breakdown between the two. But there was some concern that in the way that the FTC staff articulated the standard, that it was perhaps too broad. There was concern expressed that it's conceivable that all data should be treated the same under the standard. It's too expansive. And if you do that, you may undermine privacy, because you take away companies' incentives not to collect information that's more easily identified. And we got some interesting proposed solutions as well. And one is that companies should, if they're going to collect data, they should publicly attest to the fact that they're going to either collect it in an anonymous form, or if they anonymize it, that they promise not to re-identify it. If they do that, that would give the FTC a Section 5 hook if they violate that promise. And then there was also some comments that said, they can publicly claim to do this, and then they can contractually require any downstream purchaser or user of the data to do the same. I don't know if that answers your question, Jules, but that's where the commission staff is right now. And then just as an update, we're in the process of finalizing our privacy framework right now. There is the ongoing COPPA rule process. The comment period on that is still open, so I can't really talk too much about that. But the final privacy framework should be coming out soon, and I think it will have some analysis of these issues and talk about some of the comments and staff's thinking on them.
Justin, have you seen, I don't think I've seen post the report companies saying, well, I guess we might just treat it all as personal. Since the same rules apply, I've got the industry program that focuses on icons, I think similarly doesn't distinguish whether it's personal or not. Some of the companies are obviously also members of the NAI where there is that distinction, but if you're DAA guideline follower, you don't. But many folks who are sharing the data that's used for behavioral have said things in their privacy policies like, I don't share personal information. And so regardless, I think, of where that line has blurred, most of the users of this data are dealing with data contributors who may have said in their privacy policies, I don't share personal information. And so if you're going to use this data, you probably have to be living within, you've got to be de-identifying or using data in some non-personal way. What have you seen since the report in this area?
I mean, I really haven't seen a lot about de-identification in the behavioral advertising space because the folks in the industry do say, like you do, it's all anonymous, which always kind of sets off warning alarm bells for privacy advocates. I know Ari Schwartz, the previous person in my job, whenever you said anonymous data, he would, like, a little vein would pop out in the top of his head. I mean, one, because most of this data is not subpoena-proof, right? With a couple of subpoenas, you can trace it back to an individual pretty easily. I also think that, you know, URL streams, your web addresses over time, I'm increasingly thinking that it's probably intrinsically identifiable, much like location data is, right? So my location data, I sleep on my block in Capitol Hill, I work on Farragut Square, that's pretty easily, people kind of accept over time that's probably identifiable. I was looking at my URL stream over the weekend this morning just to kind of get a sense of how identifiable that might be. There's a lot of stuff in there about privacy stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there about University of Virginia sports. There's a lot of stuff in there about how to get a damn baby to go to sleep at night. Like around.
Any answers on that?
No. And there's a lot about Capitol Hill, right? And so in that Venn diagram, it may well be the case that's pretty easily identifiable as me just over one weekend's worth of clickstream data. Increasingly also, Jonathan Mayer at Stanford put out a report, I don't know if it's been discussed yet today, about how in URLs, increasingly you're seeing a lot of unique device identifiers. So there really hasn't been the kind of robust discussion about, you know, how do you take this information and make it not personally identifiable? And then, so you know, we're not, I think, even close to having a conversation yet. Now, what are the implications of that? You know, I think from my point of view, I care a little more about it if it is used to personalize and change the user experience, which may be different from Ashkan and maybe different from some other consumer advocates. You know, one, for the filter bubble problem, the fact that you're kind of just spoon-feeding people what that you think that they want, and you're less likely to get encounter new ideas, but also just the fact that you notice the fact of surveillance, that based on what you've done previously, you're getting different ads, and so or different other suggestions. So if you do a search for a medical condition, suddenly you start getting Viagra ads, I think you're a lot less likely to then go back online and retrieve perhaps valuable information. So I think that actually does matter in the analysis about what the companies who are collecting this so-called anonymous data should be doing. And then I think the hardest questions come up around issues of, like, market research. Like, if you're just trying to figure out, you know, how people behave to produce aggregate reports. I think in the do not track discussion, we're starting to see a lot of these issues come up for the first time. You know, previously I've always thought about market research panel-based as being an opt-in thing. I think increasingly it's not really the case. The DAA guidelines that came out recently kind of don't say, hey, it's completely fine to collect as much as you want over time. No time limit for market research purposes. I'm working the W3C process on do not track. It's a very much open question right now. I think that a lot of the hardest questions around de-identified data are going to come in that market research area.
So Ashkan, you've done a lot of the work that has occasionally shown the actual data flowing from companies to third parties, and have demonstrated that sometimes the data that is being sent intentionally or unintentionally certainly includes some explicitly personal data. What's your sort of takeaway from looking at the insides of what you've been documenting?
Well, so I think one of the things to first start out is acknowledging there's a lot of different players and they have different practices, right? So early, you know, it's a thriving industry with a lot of potential kind of revenue, and so everyone wants to try their attempt at what they think is anonymized but can generate the most revenue or generate the most insight. So treating everyone as the same as, or what trying to make generalizations is really hard, right? So we have companies like Baring that are taking certain steps to, for example, as Justin described, make sure that the Venn diagrams over time don't reveal or reveal a large enough set of people that the privacy impact isn't that huge. You might see that threshold vary from company to company, and some people might say, well, we're okay with the level of anonymization down to 20 people, or we're okay with level of anonymization down to some number, which depending on your threshold will have different privacy impacts. So one, I don't think it's you can blanket. Two, with regards to kind of people trying out anonymized data or de-identified data, I think it's, I tend to move away from kind of PII or anonymized or those words and just speak about identifiers, right? So I typically focus most of the stuff around a token of some sort, whether it's your name, it's your description, it's a unique serial number, it's your device's serial number that can be used to trace your activity over time and space, right? And so by looking at this way, you can say, take your web browsing habits over a year and say it's the same person. And to the degree that it's the same person, the volume of insights might reveal something sensitive about you, since it's linked to the same device or person or identifier or token. So I kind of fall in line with the FTC kind of thinking on this stuff. I mean, Quantcast, you guys were the first to do flash cookie respawning, one of the first companies, and I think the point there was to the value in these identifiers, right? So you were making the case that by people deleting their identifiers, you lose that click stream, and therefore it's valuable to try to uniquely identify the same user over time, such that you can provide better insights about their behavior, right? And so I think we should just unanimously agree that these identifiers or the linkability of this data is what's kind of being discussed, and people have different practices with how linkable this data is, and depending on the sensitivity on the data and as well as how much data is being linked, that's where you experience the privacy violation, right? And so maybe it's really non-sensitive data linked over a long amount of time. We might be okay with that. People's standards might vary. If it's very sensitive data linked to even your behavior once, linked to one individual once, we might have a problem with. And so I think, I don't know if that was clear, but moving away from PII and this kind of stuff and focusing on really just what the type of data is and the retention and linkability of it.
Now,
So
go ahead.
can I blow the unanimity of the agreement on that point? Taking data and attaching it to a key that is actually not identifiable does make it non-identified data, as in all of these health data sets that we've been talking about today. So I think the trick in the way that you were phrasing it there is that, well, it's a non-identified data set that tells us a lot about you. But the thing is, there's no you in there because it's a non-identified set. And that's why we're not just saying that the data in the industry is anonymized, because that sets off red flags for me too, right? It's not just whether it's anonymized or not. It's whether it's re-identifiable or not, and that is a standard that has more of a sliding scale. It's not black and white.
So-
Also, I just feel like I need to say one thing in defense, which is that Quantcast did not use flash cookies in order to respawn the other cookies. It wasn't effective what happened. When we learned that we did it, within 72
you guys were
hours,
the first ones to pull
we
it.
stopped doing
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
totally. And you would, I think, flash cookies and history, cache cookies. You guys were one of the leaders, and you turned around and disabled that right away. But
Yeah, because our intent was not there
right.
to do.
But I think the framing again was backup cookies, right? I think you guys were calling them backup cookies, the goal there is that, again, if I'm an analytics provider or some sort of provider, and I can say just from a pragmatic point of view, if it's the same user coming to your website over 30 days in the course of a month, and I count that user 30 different times because they clear their cookies every night, I have less insights about that user's activity, and two, for the kind of the publisher, they're serving impressions to 30 uniques over the course of the month instead of one unique, right? And so there's value in making sure that these identifiers are persistent, right? And all I'm saying is we want to just acknowledge that it's the linkability that we want to talk about, and that's where the insights and the value is.
So is policy enough right now as a solution in this particular area? If we assume that web analytics are useful, sites want to know how many users came and how they pathed and how many ads were delivered and the like. Before we even get to sort of the behavioral advertising where everybody's agreed there ought to be some choice and there's some higher level of sensitivity and we have programs built around it. So let's focus on the analytics just for a second. Clearly useful, every website's got analytics, and so therefore there's data linked to an identifier over time that could be, I think we agree, could be, given enough data, or things that are in the URLs, be identified. Is it enough if the site says, I treat this not personally, I want to understand how users use my site, period. And the industry, I guess, has said, well, we're not going to sell it to be used to discriminate against you in some difficult ways. Today, that's I guess, the status quo, right? Folks, maybe not everybody has said something very clearly, but is it not enough? Is it enough if sites were more clear in their policies, if they more clearly said, look, we don't do anything to try to have a name and peep at these users or allow it to be used in a way that a name is attached to it, and all we're going to do is analytics of this sort. Is that enough? Are we looking for more here from the analytics universe? Do we want them doing HIPAA type stuff? Do we want them scrubbing log files to take out inadvertent names that are transmitted if they're not being used, if the sites don't know, that they're getting them? What's wrong with the status quo?
So I think there's a gradation in the things you're talking about there, right? There's a first party doing analytics for themselves, like, so let's say as a site I have no account, like Wall Street Journal. What they can collect about me pseudonymously over time, just themselves. That's like probably the lower end of the spectrum. Then there's sites that know who I am, so then they may be a little closer to the middle. Then there's using analytics firms, third parties like Google Analytics or Omniture, that take the data, that have access to the data, but put in place reasonable silos so they can actually correlate it across time. I think that's still on the maybe a little better disclosure side of the ledger. And then there's the cross-site data, right? I think once it becomes cross-site data, then you get a lot more insight. Then you could, I think, be possibly re-identified based on the scope of what you have, right? This is why people have had such, I think, strong reaction to the Facebook like button, right? The fact that the like button, whenever you go to a site that has a like button on it, or a +1 or a Twitter button, will get the URL of the fact that you went to that site, whether you click on it or not. And people said, now Facebook knows that I went to every single site out there, which is why there's a big push in the policy community to get these sites to publicly aver that they're not going to use it for certain purposes, and they're going to get rid of it at a certain point in time. But I think once you cross that line to actually looking what someone does across different sites, I think the first party, third party is the key line.
Well, so let's assume we're in the third-party world, and again, the sites, the service providers or the sites say, we simply are trying to understand how users path through our sites. Yes, there's a lot of stuff in the log files here. We don't keep it forever, but there's a lot of stuff. Yeah. Is there a risky situation today because of that that we want addressed somehow?
A risky situation? I mean, sure. I mean, the fact that where I go, because a third-party URL stream, I think, can be intrinsically identifying, then it can be published to the world everywhere I've gone, right? I mean, if everywhere I've gone that has a Facebook like button got pushed to the world, I might be embarrassed. I could be in trouble. I don't remember where I've been the last 90 days. But it's certainly something I would like to have some control over, right? Would not necessarily want being put out there. So people have talked about what are the right things you can do there. Can you do a one-way hash? And so that solves some of the data leakage problems, but not the fact that the stream might be intrinsically identifiable. Time period cap, I think, certainly takes care of some of the issues. If you just keep it at a domain level, right, that gives you a fair amount of the insights as far as market research, although, again, there's still, I think, a fair amount of identifiability just in domains. I'm not sure that, I mean, like I said, in the World Wide Web Consortium, we've kind of put it out there, like, what's the right answer here? If someone were to say, do not track, how much of this cross-site data for just pure research purposes can be collected, we haven't gotten a good answer on that. I think it's going to be a really hard policy discussion.
And again, the use matters, right? So in the clickstream data, perhaps it's not that the data itself tied to the identifier is not that sensitive. But let's say I'm an analytics provider that only does clickstreams for medical sites, right, or kid sites, right? And I use this to measure ultimately conversions, right? And what conversions are oftentimes when you take an action, when you maybe purchase something by entering your name or signing up with your email address or doing something, right? So ultimately, the data in some form, the clickstream results in some action which is measurable, and that action is usually often tied to a person or an individual or a credit card number or an email address. And so again, the use of the data and the sensitivity of the data determine whether your question of where this threshold lies, right? So if I do it on sensitive sites and I result in a conversion, maybe yes, right? If I just do clickstream on the top 1 million sites and I don't tie it to any conversion activities and I don't record it and I keep it in some aggregate format where it only identifies some k-anonymity of 1,000 people or something like that, then maybe it's fine.
But is the concern that it's going to be released and someone's going to have access to the log files, or is it that the government's going to get it, or is it that the company is going to discriminate against you because of the sensitivity? I mean, I want to sort of figure out how much of the solution to this problem is companies being more specific that they aren't in the business of having the data used in ways that would make you scream. It's going to be used to tailor an ad or better understand which ad brought someone to click and brought someone to buy, which is probably, with some outliers, probably 99 point whatever % of what's going on out there. If the companies were more clear about the boundaries, understanding it can be fuzzy, that not everybody can tell their advertiser what they're doing with the data and so forth, but if it was more clear that the uses were all advertising marketing, would that deflate some of this? The criticisms that one hears always seem to be conflated with, here's what could happen. Is it that the government will get it? Because it doesn't seem like this is yet a big source of kind of government data. Maybe it could be. Is it that people are going to be discriminating and we should just be more clear there? Or do we have a giant technical problem that needs to be solved by people having technical prevention of identification out there?
Well, can we say all? Can we say?
Yeah, I think it's. I think Justin put his finger on some of it. It's the concept of a surveillance society, not knowing when you're being tracked, and if you are, why, and for what the tracking data is going to be used for. And I think to the extent that companies can be clear about their practices and take certain things off the board, consumers are going to be a lot more comfortable with it. So a consumer is probably going to be less threatened by the idea of being tracked if it's just for getting targeted ads based on non-sensitive categories, and they know that the tracking data isn't going to be used for insurance decisions or employment or whatever parade of horribles you want to think of.
And does being more clear mean be more clear in a privacy policy that the experts read? Or does it mean that users who are navigating and turning on their phones are going to have to somehow understand this and maybe decide, yes or no? I've been tracking recently the number of people who report that their browser has crashed to IE and Mozilla, which is kind of a, you kind of get that it'll help make not your browser work better right away, but help IE or Mozilla or somebody figure out what site made this crash. And so it's sort of good for the world. And it's opt-in today. You need to say, yes, send this data back to Mozilla or Microsoft. And I understand the number of users who say, okay, yeah, not you, none of you. It's really, really low. And so I guess the question is, I imagine everybody in the room would agree, okay, fine, if that's the solution, just like say more in my policy that I don't do really concerning things. But I guess it gets interesting when it's no, tell it to a user, and are they interested? Are they going to spend the time? Are they going to understand? I don't know. If somebody asked me, do I want my Wi-Fi router information to be shared with some company? I'd be like, oh, what the hell is that? But I kind of like the fact that my phone helps me find my location quickly and better. How much of this is transparency so that you're legally on the hook so that the FTC can take action? And then how much of this is we really want consumers understanding the nuts and bolts?
So Mozilla does a really interesting thing around Test Pilot, right? So they had a program whereby, similar to your crash data, they would display to you the data they captured, say this is going to be helpful for this type of panel that we're doing. They would show you the kind of chunks of data and highlight the potential sensitivities. And perhaps there's even better way. There's obviously better ways to do it. But then you would say, oh, okay, I'm comfortable with this. There's no whatever sense. There's no sensitive information in here that I'm concerned about, and I will send it along. And I think the presumption there is around this like data courtesy, where that the data isn't free for, if the app crashes, to automatically collect it, right? We have a current situation, I think a couple of us were talking about, with this handset issue, with the Carrier IQ issue, whereby by the app crashing, your sensitive data, such as your SMS history and your clickstream, goes to the companies like Google and the handset makers inadvertently, right? Just because it's in the log files and it's being recorded. And there's no courtesy there to say, well, are you sure you want this data? Look, why don't you look through it? It has your text messages in there. Perhaps don't send it, right? And so I think the presumption there is really around this data is free for the taking, and the user has no choice, so let's just take it.
Yeah, I'm trying to grasp the implications of what you're asking, right? I mean, it seems like that for years people have recognized in industry, maybe, again, this is not unanimous, but that there really should be improved notice about these practices, and there really should be opt-out choices around it, right? I mean, are you arguing the opposite of that? I mean, people have consistently said, right, when told about behavioral advertising practices and said, look, this is anonymous, or at least they're not going to try to identify you. If we're done on a perfectly pseudonymous basis, just deliver you ads, a lot of people just say, I don't like that. And you can tell them it's irrational, you can tell them they're stupid, you can tell them to don't be such a baby about it. But I mean, like, people should have the chance to exercise choice around that. I mean, I think improved, more clear privacy policies would probably be a slight step forward, but I mean, I think I thought we were past that, as arguing about that there shouldn't be some sort of opt-out rights. And
Yeah,
probably,
no, Justin, I'm trying to tease out where and when that starts. So we already have it, in theory, for behavioral advertising with icons and so forth, whether that works, doesn't work, works better. We have folks debating that it should happen in the EU for analytics, right? We have folks in the do not track conversation wanting it to mean not just behavioral, but tracking if it's third party and there is a possibility of aggregation. So I guess one of the interesting questions of the day is, when you've got big data sets, there's a potential of identification, right? We've all sort of agreed. And then the question is, when do you do lots of technical work, when it's health, when it's ISP data, when it's general data, and when is it that you need to be bold about it, stop the user, say, click here to say yes, or click here to say no, versus when is there a default environment where collecting data is going to be used in some useful way, in a way that you at least promise isn't harmful, and do we have a good enough model for that today?
I think though that when you're talking about sort of big data sets and re-identification, and we talked about it earlier today on the Netflix and the AOL example, those were data sets that were released to the public, and anybody can bang away at them and pull in extra data. In a lot of the cases in terms of analytics and advertising and whatnot, those aren't publicly available data sets that researchers can go and spend months and months trying to reverse engineer and find that one user and that needle in the haystack. And I agree that there needs to be some sort of people that need to understand what those users are doing, or what those companies are doing with that data. But it's not as easy to re-identify as sort of that Netflix and AOL example make it out to be when companies have big data like that.
Mm-hmm. Peter, did you?
Yeah.
Great. Let's bring you folks in. So I called on Dan earlier. So you decided that if we're talking about appending data, we need to jump through lots and lots of hoops to make sure we live up to anonymity. Why? Obviously, folks are doing appending with 3 steps. Why did you decide you needed 10 steps.
Right. So I guess I have to immediately react to the term appending, only because that's a very loaded term inside the industry. Can you use the mic, please? Sure. First, I just want to comment on the term appending, only because what we are doing is that our business is on helping marketers understand whether or not what they're doing online is actually resulting in sales offline. Well, if you think about the outcome, so privacy by design, what we really want to know is campaign 45 generated 30 sales. So that's what we should be producing. We shouldn't be producing a database of IDs that could be tracked back to either an online browser or an offline person. We're looking to capture statistics and maybe correlations. That is, gee, if I showed this ad on a blogging site, not a specific site, but a blogging site in the middle of the day, that will work a little bit better than if I show it on a news site late at night. And so that's really what we've built. We've built a system to do that. The appending issue really comes back to the issue that you have an environment where there's a presumption of not anonymity, but non-PII-ness, if you will. And there's another environment where you're clearly identified. Name and address, purchase history, all sorts of information is being traded in the offline world. And that at the point where you break that barrier between the two, you have to be very, very, very careful. And so that would be a case where, for example, for us, we've designed a system that involves federated encryption technology and some different standards. So one of the things that I question, for example, we talk about de-identification, is that there are a lot of companies that do things like, dual blind or triple blind or various different types of techniques to sort of bring different parties together. And one of the tests that I sort of bring up is it reproducible? In other words, if I do a one-way hash, can I find the data again by just hashing it again? I describe that as finding the first marble by sending another marble after it. And if you've done that, then you're probably not robustly de-identified for all circumstances. So we have the concept of irreproducible hashing, or probabilistic hashing is a very important privacy-preserving technology. The other thing I would say in de-identification to think about is this issue of that trade-off between k-anonymity and the point that was brought up earlier today about multivariate analysis, which is that for a lot of the marketing use cases, multivariate analysis is very useful, but inherently, when you can analyze all the variables, you can usually triangulate back to the individual again. So I think that the other thing the industry really is, I think, just starting to really innovate on is technologies that deliberately, effectively either fuzzy or k-anonymize the data, but in ways that make the generation of those multivariate correlations later on more achievable. So if you design for privacy at the beginning, you capture your data in a way so that no third party could come in and triangulate the data back to either a cookie or a human being, any kind of cookie or a human being, but at the same time you can support those marketing use cases. I think there's a lot of innovation. I think that's a great reason for not wanting to set the bar so high that it discourages folks from trying to find a new best practice.
Thanks, Peter.
So I'm very struck that we have an amazingly expert panel here, and the dimensions of what Dan was just saying weren't really clear to me. So if I wanted to summarize, well, here's what the best practices are now that we have this great five and extras in the room, I don't know enough yet to come close to know what those dimensions are. That's sort of striking. And I was thinking about how discussions get forced in Washington sometimes. So the Network Advertising Initiative happened more or less because DoubleClick was on the hook. Jules was there. The FTC, Commerce Department, other folks were hammering away. And under the pressure of all that, somehow some text got developed in a fairly short time. That's roughly my memory of the situation. Jules is frowning like in pain of memory or something like that. Yeah, okay. And then there's another thing that hasn't been mentioned today, which is there's this European Union thing out there that's announcing today, we're going to take 10% of your revenues from the world, and that's going to be our new penalties. There's this incredible story circulating. Almost everything that's being discussed here is probably outside the realm of what Vivian Redding probably thinks is okay. And yet we have global internet that we're trying to do. And I'm just curious, maybe for the panel, what's the setting to get from today's smart people sort of pointing towards the criteria to a year from now or whatever, having a crisper set of things that people can get closer to best practices on? Do you have thoughts about how to start to bring this together? Because it hasn't felt like it's gelled yet.
My quick answer would be that providing a little, just seeing the questions that sort of the CPOs who are kind of big part of our stakeholder audience ask me, which is, we're going to do this, there's going to be de-identification, is this enough? And if they don't know, right, senior folks at big companies or creative folks are like, we think this is pretty good, but where is the yardstick? It's not HIPAA. You know, here's Dan with an answer. Axiom has policies and practices around, you know, how they do it. Baring's got, you know, the model. I'd argue providing a little more visibility into the work that goes into that, or coming up with, well, if you have this sort of data, jump, you know, this high, I think would be really useful. But let's hear, Ashkan, you're nodding your head.
I was gonna. I think that's a great question, and absolutely, like, as we said earlier, there's many companies with different practices. Some with resources to figure out how to do the, like, whatever, super blind elephant, whatever approach to you know, not overuse the word open source, but to, like, provide those algorithms to the degree that they can be, since sometimes they're trade secrets, but to the degree that they can be published, and both, you know, technologists can poke at it and researchers can poke at it, as well as other companies that want to engage in these practices say, well, we're, you know, for these data sets, we're handling this approach of this data handling approach. I think that would be beneficial for all. We've seen, like, the Stanford guys come up with some cookbook type stuff for this, but it would be great to see companies, and Baring, I think you guys with Ann Kavukian, you guys published your document that's kind of light on the details but good in generalities. It would be great to have, like, a, you know, a follow-up to that to say, here are the code, here's the or here's the algorithm, at least in human speak, of an approach you can take if you want to be a good player. And then companies can say, we all play by these kind of good player rules. And then industry, since you guys know, you can say, hey, there's this new guy in town. He's not actually doing good player approach. He's, like, you know, he's actually not targeting on the blogger level. He's waiting to see when the person saw the ad, when that same person goes to buy the jeans in the store. They're doing that linking, and so that you can differentiate from the good players and the bad players.
I think the answer is, there really needs to be a lot more engagement with the DPAs and the Commission. Especially over these next 2 years, right? When the directive is being rewritten, turned into regulation, whatever it's going to be. I think I think they're increasingly willing to talk to companies and recognize they need guidance on a lot of these issues. The FTC, I think, has done a great job by putting out, maybe in response to your question where they draw the line on the idea of commonly accepted practices. I think that idea needs to be retailed to Europe. I think from our point of view, Do Not Track is kind of a good way to kind of bridge the middle ground between the opt-in, opt-out world, maybe sort of global opt-out for basically the sort of things that a consumer would probably care about. I think that's probably the best hope to kind of get some sort of merging together on especially these behavioral advertising practices, a little more oblique to the identification issue. But I think the short answer is that there's a window during which it's going to be crucial to educate folks in Europe about some of the perhaps unintended consequences of what they might do with the new directive.
So if the Department of Commerce were, say, to call for multi-stakeholder groups to take on self-regulatory things that became code of conduct, would de-identification for marketing consumer-type data be a topic for that segment to take on?
Yeah, and most of the stuff we're talking about really isn't. De-identification is really kind of worth talking to, right? There are all these click streams. I guess there hasn't been a lot of robust discussion about how to take this data and make it not identifiable. There is the appending issue, but that's really been much more at the margins for what most of the online advertising is today. It's an important issue, and one that I care about. Would it be the first thing I tell Commerce to take on? Probably not.
No, but Commerce doesn't have to. Like, would you be willing to, we could start here, right? Would you publish a rough algorithm of exactly what you do, the steps you take, or the Axiom guys as well? Would you just put that out there, or maybe have one of your geeks do it, like, well, you wear glasses, so maybe you are. But put it out there, and we can just start poking at it, right? And then so we have really good researchers in the room. They can start poking at it and saying, oh yeah, this is good. We kind of, as an industry.
We're definitely looking for engagement. We talked to people like Justin and I had a conversation already. we're definitely looking to have folks take a look at it. But just to get it out there, we're a venture-backed startup.
Of course.
We think that there's a way to do something that can help the market, that we can sleep well at night in terms of the sort of the privacy and public policy issues, but at the same time, we do have intellectual property we have to protect. But there's ways for us to engage, the community.
It's a prisoner's dilemma game, though. If you
Well,
don't
I guess
do
the
this-
issue isn't necessarily the unique technology, right? It's, what does reasonable security mean? I don't need to know, the exact way you're repelling invaders, but I will get in trouble if I haven't done some key things. And right now, we don't know if it means, Chris Seguin, if he was here, would say subpoena proof, I don't want the government to get it. And then other folks would say, well, that's a lot of work for stuff that they don't seem to ask for that isn't really what they use. This is to help my, website work better. So how about I just make sure there's no peeping so that Peter's concerned about employees, looking at their friend's clickstream or some third party turning it into some identified thing that somebody will use in some way that's unhappy, right? I mean, do we have some work to do before we get to sort of the technology? Do we need to say how there are folks who are saying there's no big deal here, there's no harm here, leave me alone, why are you bothering me, this is marketing data. And then there are folks saying, okay, fine, I'll do some work to try to have good hygiene around this, I'll have a retention period, I'll look for personal information leaking, I want to do, I want to manage the risk here by making sure I'm not going to be sued or called out. And then there are folks layering on even more, but we don't seem to have any consensus about how high anyone needs to jump, even if they're in the marketing. We sort of said that if it's health or something that somehow might lead to some greater concern, we seem to want a little more there. But we seem to still be over the map on, plain vanilla, potentially identifiable, lots of just internet data.
Well, so real quick, how many people here are from industry? Show of hands. And how many of you guys have a data retention policy on your website that's clear about the data you collect and how long you retain it for?
Mm-hmm. Or internal. Or internal. How many people have it, at least internal, if it's not external, right? Because I'd argue one of the reasons why, and I bother the FTC every time I'm on a panel with somebody, one of the reasons why people haven't done a lot to post it externally is because this is probably an area where having some room to one day say, oh, wait, I'm keeping my search data 6 months, but if I keep it 8 months, I can build another Google Translate. I can, change the world. And changing that, I think today, the FTC might consider a material change with all the effort to go back and opt in and, not be able to use the previously collected data. I'd argue that if we want to see some privacy innovation, we might need to give companies the chance to say, hey, I'm going to be really conservative about something, like Yahoo did when they had a tight search policy, but they didn't ever put it in their external policy, and in the end, they decided it didn't work, and they went back to a longer policy. So, Peter, what would your thought be? Is there some way that we can, short of, hey, you're making a representation that consumers are relying on, where is there room for people to try something a little more conservative and then learn that it doesn't work? Today, if they stay it, they're on the hook, and that's why I think a lot of folks have policies that internally they're trying to manage their risk, but they're nervous about externally committing to it when they don't know what new features might be useful next year or what they might be held to task over.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the rub. It's, I don't think the answer is a completely vague, we collect everything we can and we keep it until we figure out how to monetize it, so tough darts. The FTC, and I think this will be reflected in our final report, but it has in the preliminary document as well, we get that companies need flexibility, that innovation has brought a ton of consumer benefits, and there's a commitment to keeping that open. But maybe one of the answers is the privacy by design, where you only collect the data you need for a specific purpose, you get rid of it. A lengthy privacy policy that is just an attempt to limit liability doesn't inform consumers at all, and it, I think, makes them distrustful. So I'm not sure exactly where to draw that line, but...
So what would you think about a concept, maybe not of privacy minimization, because you've got folks saying, well, but I might have things I want to do, and then clearly the extreme of I need it because I might have some purpose for it, but maybe it's optimization. Is there some potential foreseeable use, and what is the additional risk created by keeping it X amount of time? And so, maybe keeping something 10 years to get 1% additional value, maybe that fails the test, but having it, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and getting significantly more value. So maybe it's more optimization than minimization. I don't know. Let me throw it to Stuart.
Thank you. But I mean, what you're basically talking about is a kind of risk analysis, which, as everybody in this room now knows, I'm all in favor of. So, excuse me, that's all well and good. I do want to touch on the previous pointer exchange, which is being made about how can we share generalized solutions or approaches. Sounds to me a lot like what's being asked for are privacy design patterns, which there have been various attempts in the academic literature to actually generate privacy design patterns that never really gotten much traction that I'm aware of. And you might have to finagle them in terms of the level of abstraction to deal with the IP concerns. But that would seem to be an avenue that would be worth exploring. But what I really want to touch on is this whole issue, or to go back to this whole issue of use, of data use. And at the risk of sounding like a dog that can't let go of the phone, the fact of the matter is that if you're using data generated by a person in some way, regardless of whether you know who they are, you can associate that specific data, clickstream, whatever, with that specific person. The fact that you are using that data could result in privacy harms that have absolutely nothing to do with issues of identification and surveillance. A number of years ago, there was a very affecting essay in the New York Times by a woman who, she was pregnant, she miscarried. By the time she miscarried, she was on advertising lists hither and yon for baby products. And those lists not only center stuff, they tracked kind of how her baby would have been growing. And so over the course of years, as she put it, I could almost, watch this phantom life of my dead child progress based on the ads I was getting.
There's actually a list that the industry uses to, unfortunately, eliminate those.
So my point is, I could easily, now these companies actually had her name, her address, they knew who she was, but I could easily see that happening online based purely on profiling, clickstream data. They don't know who she is, they just know that she fits this pattern of people who are interested in baby products, and so she just starts getting fed this endless stream of stuff. Well, there was obviously real harm there. I mean, this woman was emotionally tortured, basically, for quite some period of time. Obviously, that wasn't the intention, but nevertheless, that was the effect. So I would argue here was a case of clear privacy harm, almost totally absent identification.
So do you like the way the industry, or at least some companies, have started solving that by giving you access? Yahoo, Google, a number of companies will show you your profile and let you tweak it and add or subtract, making it a little bit more like an Amazon experience. Is that?
Well, I don't want to discount the good intent, but part of the problem you get into, at least from my perspective, is these solutions almost invariably end up placing ever greater burdens on individuals to police their data. I mean, God, I don't even want to think about how many companies have PII on me. And so access is a fair information practice. I'm not arguing against providing people with access, but I would argue that simply giving individuals access, to these countless repositories with their PII is not a realistically manageable solution for most people.
Let me move to the mobile side of the world. Adam?
Yeah, I'm with JumpTap, we're a mobile ad network, and I actually had a direct, there's more just a personal question, and how you would address what exists today on the PC side with, NAI's universal opt-out, illustrations because there's still direct mail to do. But you know, it strikes me that where I would love the mobile world to get to as soon as humanly possible is to at least replicate some of the universal standards around the notice that people do receive, i.e. it is very easy on the PC side to show a privacy policy link and really expect just about every publisher to show that on their pages. A little harder in the mobile app, limited mobile app real estate. And then also there's a universal opt-out capability that we have on the PC side. And at best, we're only still going to get to the point where somebody could universally opt out in the web world, and then they still need to do it in the app world. And now we've got certain OSs making it practically impossible to have universal opt-out in the app ecosystem.
Let me repeat part of that so that the video can get it. So Adam's frustration is that with all the problems we're talking about in the PC world, you've got some degree of cookie controls. Maybe we'll have do not track. You've got, you know, universal opt-out cookies. Again, Stuart, I think you'd argue they fall short, but there are a bunch of tools out there. And on the mobile side, there's a fragmented environment. There are not cookies always used across. The opt-out tools aren't there. You've got to put in your user ID, and it's 40 characters. It's a bit of a mess. And Adam's arguing, hey, I'm a mobile ad network. I want to give people a good choice. I guess the question I have, maybe back to you, Adam, or others, is that we've been working with CDT on, you know, app best practices, and some of the pushback has been, and we've been like, well, how about requiring some of that over there? And the pushback has been, but it's too soon. We don't know what the business models are going to be, and you'll mandate something that maybe works there, but we don't yet know. And can the apps be the ones in charge of it? Because it's the mobile ad networks, but it's these characters, it's the operating systems, the OS. And so we end up, I think, back in that sort of chicken and egg, you know, world of who should go first. It took 10 years to go from the NAI principles to sort of the DAA, which are essentially a NAI plus an icon for everybody instead of just for ad networks, right? And so will it take 10 years when mobile is sort of feeling the pain today? Or will we, maybe we need to do what Stuart said, instead of doing best practices, which scare folks because then they're obligated or it'll become a law, maybe what we need is design patterns where folks can at least see something that somebody said was a good way that they worked it out. And those are the things that maybe lead to, you know, best practices. Of course, that doesn't give the instant opt-out that we want the platforms to give. So to the ears of the platform folks in the room, please give the ad networks and the app folks the controls they want. Let me take one final question before we, yes, Ashken.
There is a Berkeley project called Privacy Design Patterns by Nick Doty, and it's around location privacy. So if people are interested, there's a source for that. And there is also some work to try to put do not track into mobile, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the work Jim Brock is doing as well to set certain guidelines for the 3 people in the garage, you know, who don't have a deep, deep understanding of privacy. You know, that goes a long way as well. I think there are some unique aspects to mobile that still need to be tackled. Probably the 3 most relevant, one is which you hinted at was location, but I mean there's also screen real estate issues, and finally, as Jules was alluding to, there's a role that just by the growth of the ecosystem right now, the platforms do play a very significant part.
Great. Do we have a final question before we move to the next panel? No, we're good. Great. Well, let me thank our panelists here for their time.